Hi. So hi again, and I'm happy to welcome you all at today's session with Tatsiana Zamirouskaya. My name is Ksenia Stelenkova. I'm from European Humanities University, and I'm a faculty member and a leading faculty of the Freedom of Expression Network class, and I'm happy to be moderating our session today. In case you would like to pose your questions to Tatsiana during today's conversation, please use our chat box or raise your hand with the reactions on Zoom. And I think that a couple of words needed to be said about our topic today. And Tatsiana Zamirovskaya is joining us today to discuss the topic of bilingualism versus no-lingualism and speechlessness as a tool. Tatsiana is a writer and a journalist from Belarus, currently residing in Brooklyn, New York, and she's famous for her books, which are metaphysical short story collections. And Tatsiana is shortlisted of various awards, and she's also a recipient of fellowships, including the fellowship from Macdowell Colony and Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. And what is more, Tatsiana has an MFA from Bard College, Milton, Avery Graduate School, and I'm happy that she's joining us today. And I think that the last thing I need to say is that today's session is conducted with the aid and with the support of European Humanities University, as well as with OSUN and Bard Translation and Translatability Initiative. And at this point, I'm honored to be turning over to Tatsiana. So Tatsiana, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you for such a nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me. Hope I can be helpful. So I would like to share my personal experience of writing and translating, and I'm also going to share some advice on books to read about that, and I will also provide some tips about writing in a non-native language. But in general, I would like to speak about displacement in language and about how feeling speechless finally worked for me, worked as a metaphor and also as a writing method. So as you know, I've lived most of my life in Belarus, and I moved to New York, to Brooklyn 6 years ago to do my MFA at Bard. And Belarus, as you all also know, is a weird place. It kind of stuck in between languages, Russian, Belarusian, and all of those various dialects like Trasyanka, the one which originates from broken Russified Belarusian.
Okay, I'm sorry, something happened, I see.
No, I'm good. I suddenly became muted.
Oh, that's strange. That's strange. Just another technical remark for our guests. Please mute your mics if you are not speaking, so that not to interrupt Tatsiana. Thank you.
Okay, so Belarus is stuck in between languages and also between worlds. So I would say that our collective consciousness is somewhere in between this post-Soviet patriarchal culture and the European cultural paradigm. So we're always like shifting. And also Belarusians have always historically referred to themselves as locals during all the many wars happened on its territory. So that's why being local meant that we don't belong to any side or any army. And what's more important, that this unidentification was our only way to survive. It means that the population of our country probably descended from silent, unidentified survivors of really terrible things. So in general, it means if you're alive, you probably descended from those who could hide real well. Otherwise, from those who were silent or were just lucky. So during my time at Bard, which marked my absence from Belarus, I realized that sometimes, although I'm really assured of the truthfulness of the stories I narrate about Belarus, about autocracy, about what is happening in my country. All of these narratives sound a bit fake to me, as if English language makes them slightly unreal. I remember once I was telling somebody a story about my encounters with KGB officers after me and my friends organized a meeting with a Ukrainian-Lithuanian writer in a Belarusian gallery. And I remember I've been telling this story, and at some point I said, I'm not sure I'm telling the truth though. And after I finally articulated that, it became fictional. And I'm still unsure if my personal memory was damaged by turning it into a narrative. And so this is how I finally realized that what actually interests me as a writer is this unsureness of memory, this in-betweenness and the damage. And moreover, the damage of speech and language and total impossibility of translation. So when I just started to study at Bard, translation and impossibility to translate myself was my nightmare. I've always been thinking, how can I actually show them I'm a good writer? Because nobody reads Russian, nobody understands Russian. And my short stories, they were so surreal, so weird, and they've been based on language tricks. I've also been always obsessed with this Soviet surrealism, with ghost stories, scary tales, Soviet children's folklore. And I've been growing up reading this strange surreal poetry of Daniel Karms, Vedensky, Zabolotsky, and their dark absurdism and this linguistic playfulness was a perfect reflection of totalitarian era. As Boris Groys said, it didn't even oppose Stalinism as much as it actually described it. So it was very normal for me as a Belarusian to write scary, absurd stories about distorted normativities where surreal things happen as if they're the norm. And I've tried to self-translate those stories. But translating them from Russian, I realized it was more a psychoanalysis than an actual translation. Because I've been closely observing myself while translating and writing, and I realized that my detachment from my mother tongue and my country, it influenced my perception, my vision, and my approach to creative practice. So while translating with every single line, I've been asking myself, what's that you were really trying to say here? Did you use this metaphor for the sake of nice metaphor, or there is a meaning in it? And if there is a meaning, please reconstruct this meaning or make it understandable to English speakers. So it was rewriting, but it was not a translation. And even after having translated those short stories, I still felt they're not the same. They look like bad translations, even after my friends helped me to fix articles and tenses, all those regular things usually difficult for us Russian speakers. But still, everything was a bad translation. I felt I am a bad translation. And my bilingual friends looked at those translations and they also said, oh, your voice is not there. They meant like your unique, your idiosyncratic voice is not there. And that was really depressive because after I became bilingual, everybody suddenly had an opinion about my voice, as if voice is the only essential thing. So for instance, every time I wrote a Facebook post in English, my Belarusian friends who knew English really well, they commented, wow, in English you have such a different voice. This is not you. Or they could even say, you're much more funny and weird in Russian. English doesn't preserve that. But at the same time, for my English-speaking friends, I've still been funny and weird, and I was still myself. So probably that was not the language that was the problem. Maybe there was a linguistic identity which was confused for my real identity. I've also thought, well, maybe my Belarusian friends were just afraid of me speaking with an unfamiliar voice. Or maybe this was their way to say, you're a stranger now, and now you have two personalities, so you're not one of us. But strangely, I didn't feel bilingual at all. I felt no-lingual, numb, speechless, languageless, silent, and muted. So while thinking about all that, I did a performance at BART about impossibility of translation and feeling mute. I'm going to share with you what I what I actually did, because you can try to do it yourself. It's quite easy if you have friends who are bilingual. So what I did, I've self-translated my short story about a man who decided to start his life over, started anew. It was a very short story, so it was a one-page little translation. And I asked my friend, Anastasia, who was at my class, to help me. It was weird, but they had two Belarusians in my class. I think it happened for the first and last time at BART when they accidentally enrolled two girls from Belarus to MFA program. So yeah, Anastasia was also from Belarus, but she moved from Belarus to States when she was a teenager. So her English was very natural. She actually speaks like it's her first language. But her Belarusian and her Russian has slightly shifted. So the performance I did, it looked like that. Everybody was having a page with my self-translation. And then I went to a stage and I asked everybody to follow the translation while actually listening to me speak. And I started to read aloud my short story in Russian, sentence by sentence, while Anastasia was translating it simultaneously. So there were three layers of the story to follow simultaneously. It was my original voice and tone in Russian, like totally unfamiliar language to everybody. Then there was my self-translation, which they could actually follow, and they've been perceiving it visually. And obviously it was the most exact and clear version of how I wanted my story to be perceived. But it had mistakes, of course. And it was the simultaneous translation they could hear into perfect English with any mistakes. It was just perfect translation ever. But how could they know it's perfect? The language was perfect, but was the translation perfect? Because it was a translation by somebody whose Russian was not perfect. Of course, she could mishear something, she could misinterpret, she couldn't get probably some jokes, and she did. So the text everybody was reading on the paper, and the acoustic version of the story they heard from Anastasia were dramatically different. Those were like two different short stories. And to prove which one was true, they had to rely only on my tone and voice because it was in Russian. So it was a great experience for everybody because they could finally see how I feel stuck in between those languages. And it also showed how much is always lost during translation, because they could see with their own eyes the gaps, the differences, the missing words. Like there were two sentences and they were not the same. And it was up to them to decide if they preferred to believe bad English from the one who created the story, from the author, or to believe good English from the one who just heard the story for the first time and may be very unfamiliar with the story. But I honestly think that both versions were true and they've been correct. And those gaps and differences are the real truth there. Truth about impossibility of a good translation, because it's always a matter of interpretation. And more importantly, this is how I finally realized that you don't need a perfect language to show who you are and how you feel. And after that, I totally lost the fear of losing my voice in another language. I think it was just fear of losing my verbal identity. But I thought, is this important at all? Why I was afraid to lose my perfect Russian, and why I was so ashamed of writing in a non-perfect English. And moreover, why are we so obsessed with the concept of adequately expressing ourselves? Because actually there are so many other things to express. when I talked about this to one of my professors, the brilliant writer and poet Anna Moskvakis, she said, "Don't translate, just write in English. This is going to be your thesis project." Of course, first I was terrified. I was like, no, my English is bad. No, I cannot do that. But she recommended me a wonderful book. It's called Why the Child is Cooked in the Polenta. And she said that it's also written in a bad language, but it's a very good book. And maybe it's that good only because the language is bad. So I was really intrigued. And of course, I started to read this book. It was really stunning. If you haven't read it, I absolutely advise everybody to find it somewhere. The English translation is quite good. It's an autobiographical work by Aglaya Veterani. She was Swiss, but with Romanian origin. She's from Bucharest. And as a child, she was traveling with street circus with her mom, who was performing there in this street circus. So they just wandered around all Europe, and Aglaya, the little girl, she could badly speak many languages, so all the European languages, but she couldn't write in any. She was illiterate till she was 16. So she was languageless. And then when she grew up and when she settled in Switzerland, she decided to learn German and wrote a book about her childhood in a very simplified, minimalistic German about her traveling with that Romanian circus. And of course, this was not a nice experience at all. And it was a very traumatic memory because, of course, there was lots of fear, violence, and she stayed in boarding houses. And her mom was actually performing some crazy tricks, like she'd been hanging herself on her hair. And after each performance, the girl was afraid her mom is going to die eventually. And she died, of course. So it's a terrifying book, but it's amazing. In fact, it's a writing about displacement from home, from mother tongue. Her original language was Romanian. And however scarily and weirdly this book was written, it was a masterpiece. And it even reminded me of that surreal poetry I used to enjoy when I was a kid about Daniel Karms, because it's also a bit absurd and surrealistic. And probably when you write about the most terrible memories of your childhood in this deadpan, minimalistic voice, without emotions, just describing the actions and the memories, maybe it turns slightly weird and surreal. And by the way, I have to mention, though Aglaya was a survivor, eventually she didn't manage to survive. She committed suicide. She drowned herself in the lake after becoming a famous published writer, after her book became really big. But anyway, when it seemed her life is finally back on track and nothing bad can happen to her, it happened. So through this book, I remembered another book which influenced me a lot. It's called The Notebook by Agota Kristov. I know there are several translations of the title in Russian. It's Толстая тетрадь. It's like the large notebook. It also has this perspective of unbearable, unspoken things seen and told by a child in a very minimalistic and simplified and unemotional way. It tells the story of two boys, siblings, brothers, who were trying to survive during the war. And Agota Kristov, who was originally from Hungary and also Switzerland, she intentionally wrote this book in a language she didn't know well, in French. So she wanted to speak about traumatic and unspeakable things, about something you usually say, I'm speechless. So she literally chose the language she was speechless in. And so she used it as a metaphor and as a method. My friend, a famous Ukrainian fantasy writer, Max Fry, once wrote about this book. I'm going to quote it because it's a very good quote. I've been enchanted and scared by the author's challenging simplicity of language and syntax. Subject, verb, object, that's it. Suddenly, I've realized that the novel's language looks like a very successful attempt of translation to human language from the non-human language, from Martian language or insect language. We humans don't speak that way, and we humans don't write that way. Nobody does this, but Agota Christoph and her characters do. This is a very essential thing, translation from a non-human to human language. And maybe feeling speechless is also something which helps you to see things from a non-human perspective. And this is probably how you can see things better. I'm used to having migraines with auras. Those who maybe sometimes have the same condition know what I mean. So those migraine auras they could be very, very different. Sometimes they're visual, you see bright spirals in the sky, you see flashes, you sometimes may lose your areas of vision, you have the tunnel vision and stuff, but sometimes those auras are verbal, or better to say non-verbal. So I can suddenly lose the sense of speech at all, as if speech is one of the senses, like smell or eyesight. It happens immediately, and it usually doesn't last long. It's like maybe 2 or 3 minutes. But in these 2 minutes, you are illiterate. So when you look in the book, you just see weird signs instead of words and letters. And when people speak to you, you just hear weird, funny sounds from them, which means nothing to you. And you cannot say a word because you just don't know how to do it. You just lose the whole idea of speech. But what is more amazing, you still perceive things. You still see the images, you still feel, you still have emotions, and you are still yourself. And you know it. You know that you are still you. So what makes you is not speech, actually. So it was a revelation to me to realize that even when you have no speech, you are still there. So it means you are not your language. And this is very liberating. So I indeed wrote my thesis at Bard in English entirely from scratch without translation. It was a novella based on my broken or traumatic memories on Belarus. I've suddenly realized that in English, it's much easier for me to speak about traumatic things, about elections, about dictatorship, about my experience of working as a music journalist in a country where certain musicians are banned or blacklisted. In Russian, writing fiction, I've been storytelling. So I've been inventing various absurd plots and I was making up weird things, but I've never spoken straight. And in English, I could finally say it straight. I've also realized that writing about certain memories in English helped me to reshape and rebuild those memories. Actually, you can even change your past with language if you want, because you probably know that our minds are not like computers. We don't store memories in our brains. There's no storage. There are just neural paths, and you go along this path every time you would like to remember something. So every time we remember, we literally recreate it. And language is what forces us to recreate it the way language is organized. So our memories are nothing but language we use for speaking about them. And we're kind of trapped in the certainty and predictability of our mother tongue. But if we try to remember something in a language we don't speak perfectly, in a second language, we are actually liberating ourselves from the cliches and predictabilities. And this way we can remember much more, or even fix traumatic memories, or even heal ourselves. So this is when I started to think about totalitariety of language. Russian language is totalitarian, not only because it affects my thinking and my memories, But for us, people from Belarus, it's in fact non-metaphorically totalitarian because we've been forced to speak it, in fact. So we didn't choose this language. In the 30s, as all the Belarusians know, Stalin killed almost all of the Belarusian intelligentsia, the creative forces of young Belarus. Hundreds of poets, writers, philosophers, scholars who've been speaking Belarusian language, they were executed. So it was not our choice to speak Russian. We didn't want it to be our mother tongue. We just were born with parents who spoke this language. So I thought then, why I'm so holding on to it? Why I'm so holding on to perfectness of my Russian? Only because it's the only language I know perfectly? And then I started to think, why we're all holding on to perfection? For in Belarus, when you finally decide you want to start speaking Belarusian language, there's always this weird stage when you already can write in Belarusian, you can read it, but you never speak it with other people because you're ashamed. Not of the language, it's a beautiful language, but you're kind of shy and intimidated because you're afraid your Belarusian is not that perfect. And maybe the ones who speak it perfectly are going to correct you or point at your mistakes, and they will know you're not that good. And this is really crazy how many Belarusians went through this fear of speaking. But you never become perfect in a moment. So there's always imperfection on your way. And also it's weird that we're afraid of this imperfection if somebody is going to punish us for that. And this is how I found books by Jhumpa Lahiri. I also really advise everybody to read her books, especially the one called In Other Words. She's an American with a Bengali heritage, and she wrote a book in Italian. She learned it as a second language. And though she didn't know it perfectly, it was the only way for her to speak about her immigrant identity. Because as an immigrant, as a daughter of immigrant parents, she always felt worse than other people. She felt imperfect and she couldn't even express it. But she said that writing in Italian was a key to see things in a different way. I'm quoting her, to see things with a sort of directness that I was always a little afraid of and self-censoring of in English. My Italian is unusual, it's imperfect. There are all sorts of lapses and problems inherent in my ability to express myself in this language. And yet I feel so powerful. I feel like I can say anything I want to say. I think that's what any artist is looking for, that freedom. So to escape from the totalitarian control of the mother tongue means to finally feel liberated. And maybe this is what I mean by saying that you are not your language. Also, while reading and researching on speechlessness, I've been interested in aphasia, both clinically and metaphorically. So you know that aphasia is this condition when you actually lose your speech, but it's most often is connected with brain injuries. So there's glimpses of lost sense of speech I had during migraines are similar to aphasia one can get from a brain stroke, for instance, or from an injury. So I've started to research and read a lot about aphasia and speech deprivation. Of course, I read Jacobson and Oliver Sacks. And also there's a wonderful book by Elena Shubina about public aphasia and the biopolitics of language. And also a great book by Kalpana Rahita Seshadri, Hum Animal, Race, Low Language. And during my research, I've realized that a broken language sometimes is the best way to construct a broken narrative to represent a broken memory about a traumatic event. And there is another book which helped me a lot. I also can totally advise to everybody to read it. It was written by Alexander Luria. He was the acclaimed, very popular Soviet Russian neuropsychologist, with whom Oliver Sacks actually corresponded, being his devoted follower. And it was a surprise for me to learn that, in fact, the genre of this neuropsychology case storytelling, which Oliver Sacks was popular with, it was in fact invented by Luria. So he wrote a book called The Man with the Shattered World, the story of a brain wound. It's about a soldier who had a critical brain injury, but he survived. And he lost like half of his brain. So a significant part of his brain cortex just didn't function. And his mind was literally broken to pieces. And all of his remaining life after the injury, 26 years, he was desperately trying to reclaim his shattered world through writing. And the memoir of that man with traumatic aphasia was probably the most emotionally affecting literature I've ever read. And yes, it's literature. He could barely talk, but the part of his brain connected with feelings and emotions remained intact. So he was still human, he was himself, and he knew that. So he wrote very clearly, strangely, and he always was meditating over his brain's inability to systemize his memory dysfunctions. And for some reason, his writing was incredibly beautiful. Like, here's a little piece of this writing. So he writes, I can't understand how a tree came to life and what it consists of. And everything I touch, all of this turned mysterious and strange to me. I can't make anything up. I can't guess anything. I can't create anything new. I became someone else, someone contrary to what I've been before this terrible wound. Oliver Sacks said that in this book, science actually became poetry. And the thing that really fascinated me was that the man's brain damage didn't affect his writing abilities, but it affected his reading and his perception. So he could write and he could reflect on his poor condition, but he didn't have any access to what he'd just written. It was like hermetic type of text, which appears before one's eyes only at the moment of writing to disappear completely. And I thought that that's what actually turns tragedy into poetry. And also, while researching about how people speak when they are unable to speak, I spoke a lot with Deirdre Boyle. She's a wonderful writer and my friend whom I met at the residency in Virginia. She was also researching speechlessness and trauma, because she's currently finishing a book about films of Ritipan. He's a famous Cambodian film director. He was an Academy Award nominee for his movie, The Missing Picture. And I also totally recommend it to everybody because it's a heartbreaking work and it's beautifully made. So it's a film about him being the survivor of Red Khmer regime and genocide. And most of his relatives died in labor camps. So his parents died, his sisters, nephews, cousins, everybody. And he himself could miraculously escape to Thailand. And then he fled to France. And in France, he became a famous movie director. So the only way he could tell a story about his family was by recreating, literally, each family member as a little clay figurine, as a puppet, like little sculpture. And he himself made these little clay puppets of his parents, his siblings, his sisters, all of his village. So everybody he remembered, he didn't write about these people, he just created them as little dolls, as puppets. And that was the only way he could narrate his trauma, without words, just with the body and with the help of the objects. So the movie, it's like something between animation and a live diorama, but animation is the most correct word, anima. So he was resurrecting the past, resurrecting his relatives, not with the help of language, because he had no words for that. And later he said in some interview that it was a successful attempt to try and find his lost childhood. So he could finally find it. And he said once about that movie that he said, and my childhood returned. Now I see the boy there who seeks me out, and I see him, and he wants to speak with me, but words are hard to find. So words are hard to find, that's it. And Deirdre told me that during the trials at those who have been executing people in Cambodia, the executioners, they couldn't remember what they have been doing to people, like how they tortured people. They couldn't even speak about it. Because first, they've been teenagers at that times, because most of those who tortured people were very young, because young people were just easier to be brainwashed and manipulated. So as grown-up people, they had no words to describe how they tortured everybody, because they were speechless. But once one of them was taken to a former prison camp site, and he was asked not to tell, but to show, like, show us what you did to them. And he started to show it like he was an actor. So his body remembered everything his consciousness tried to forget. So it turned out that the traumatic memory is a body memory. It's not the text memory. And it can be recreated through the body, but not through the text. So, of course, I've also read I've reread all of Svetlana Alexievich's books, where people tell about things that are impossible to live through and impossible to tell about. As I read in one book by Joanna Lindblad about Alexievich, when the witness tries to incorporate a traumatic experience into a coherent narrative, he will inevitably be affected by the insufficiency of language. Laub describes this ambivalence in terms of a conflict between two imperatives, the imperative to tell and the impossibility of telling. So these things, imperative to tell versus impossibility of telling, is very essential for us Belarusians. And for me personally, it also was a pretty sharp definition of what I was doing and what I've been looking for, because we all have a great fear of non-expressing ourselves, or of seeming damaged, aphatic, fear, like we fear of not finding words to describe something. And actually, I've realized I need to overcome my fear of being a broken mechanism, especially if I'm indeed broken. So I gave myself the freedom of not pretending to be a native English speaker, and that was a real freedom. So I could express much more, and I finally started to write in a totally different way. So I never wrote short surrealistic stories after that. I turned to larger and more serious narratives, I would say, because I finally realized I have the power and freedom to do that. So now I'm going to speak a bit about speechlessness as a tool, and about how I was writing my thesis novella in English and how it actually affected my Russian afterwards. So I've been trying to create a no-style text space. I got rid of my personal writing style in Russian, something I cherished a lot, something very deeply incorporated into my thinking, dictating, and narrating every story I write, as if text is writing itself. But by achieving this stylistic detachment from my personal system of metaphors and from traditions and stereotypes of the Russian language, I could closely examine the bare, pure system of images, myths, and values I'm operating with. It was like getting access to the right brain hemisphere, the one not connected with the linguistic systems. John Cage once said that he loves using chance operations in composing music, and for the same very reasons, to get rid of his own preferences from his previous choices, creative stereotypes, and memories. He said we all need to practice chance operations in creative work to finally be free of our memories and choices. So sometimes when I couldn't find a correct word in English, I could just choose the first random one which came to mind. Or for instance, once I tried to translate the Belarusian saying, Тотальная млявость и обыяковость до бытия, absolute lethargy and indifference to being. And I felt, no, it's a bad translation. So I tried to translate it in all the possible ways I could. It was infinite sluggishness and indifference to being, unlimited languor and indifference to being, and so on. So it all was changing, but only indifference to being didn't change at all. And finally, I translated this phrase in a way that it was an exact quote from Heidegger, which was kind of funny and scary at the same time. So I probably was trying to work out the language of non-belonging. And I really wanted to free myself from the dictatorship of mother tongue, which was not my grandmother's tongue, a common theme for Belarusians. Because our mothers and our grandmothers sometimes don't share the same language. So after that experiment of writing in English, after I finished that little novella, I've realized that my Russian became also affected by that experience. So something I've been really afraid of finally happened. My Russian became slightly fractured, slightly broken, imperfect, and weird. But finally, for me, it was a liberation. Because finally I could reinvent my Russian and use it as a second language, because it felt like a second. It was not automatic, it became much more simplified, and the metaphors were not that predictable or intuitive. So it was slightly broken and I was really happy because it was my revenge to Russian. I thought, okay, I could finally dismantle it. So in this new reinvented Russian as a second language, I actually wrote my new novel. It's called The Deadnet, or The Internet of the Dead. It's a very large book about digital resurrection, human and non-human memory, and immortality. It's based on Russian cosmism, object-oriented ontology, and artificial intelligence research. I would say it's metaphysical science fiction, though of course it's not genre literature. It will be published in May, hopefully, in Moscow. And to be honest, I wouldn't have written a large novel without reestablishing my new relations with Russian language. The protagonist in this novel is the digital copy of the dead person's consciousness. So she can speak and think only in repetitions, memories, cliches of the language, because she can't say anything new and her mind is wandering in circles. And she's also partly speechless because she's nothing but speech, however paradox it may sound. And without my new attitude to language, I couldn't have written that. And so currently with this book, I'm at the final stage of editing the novel. It will be published by Elena Shubina Imprint in Moscow. It's a very large, it's a very cool publisher. And I'm working with an editor. It's also funny, my Russian editor, she's incredibly smart. She's very educated and her Russian language, of course, is perfect. But she always wants to correct my Russian. And she always says, we Russians don't speak like that. This needs to be corrected. And I realized that my usual reply is, I'm not Russian, so I would like to keep my accent. And this is really cool. Sometimes she can see Belarusian words I use there unintentionally. And for some reason, I also insist of keep those as accent, because I don't see those as mistakes. And I think that Russian language, of course, it left a mark on Belarusian language. There's so many Russian words in Belarusian. So now I'm like giving them something back. Like, thank you for enriching our language. I'm going to enrich your language too. So for instance, in Belarusian, we have more than 10 words for swamps because we've got many swamps. And of course, like we have the right to classify levels of swampiness. So why not enrich Russian with these words for swamps? Also, recently, I found out that in Belarusian, you can say became slightly calmer than before in one word, поспокойнел. And there is no way to say this in Russian. In Russian, there are several words to say that. So after I used this word in my novel and my editor wanted to correct it, I said, no, it's a Belarusian word. It's a good word. Let's keep it. So I think as any colonial languages, Russian can also change, and it can borrow words from other cultures, especially the cultures it damaged a little bit. So even if I see that my Russian became slightly weird, now I would like to keep it this way because it actually shows I'm alive. And I think that things alive are the things shifting and changing. Trin T. Minha, who was the visiting writer at Bard MFA, she once said something that really struck me a lot. She said that you have to depart your mother tongue to leave it, and then to accept it anew from scratch, but from the position of a stranger. So it means that after you finally learn how to be silent and how to be mute, after this experience of speechlessness, you can finally learn how to speak anew. And this will be a totally new and very powerful voice. So maybe that's the main thing I actually learned as a writer. So that's it. Thank you. And I'm happy to hear any questions, any kinds of questions from you. You can ask me about anything, about the new book or about maybe some other projects I'm working at. For instance, I'm collecting the dreams of Belarusian people about Lukashenko. That's also a linguistic project because it has a lot to do with language people use to describe the dictator, about language of Belarusian subconscious. So
thank you so much, Tanya. And I would really like to share our reactions first and encourage our guests to share the questions. So please use the chat box, or in case you'd like to address your question in person, just raise your hand and we will ask you to turn on your camera and actually ask your questions. And while you are thinking over your questions, let me start with a question to Tanya. First of all, thank you so much for sharing this, and I think this is a great inspiration for all of us, and especially for those who are making the steps in their own creative writing careers. And while you were talking, I've been thinking about the way we are studying the course of freedom of expression, as the first thing we are getting to know is the phenomenon of parousia, which is an ancient phenomenon of free speech and courage to say something. And I think that this thing is very much related to your own position of this opposition between political statement in its broader sense for a writer and those stylistic nuances. And my question is, how you define literature still. So when you are reading other authors' texts, what are the criteria which help you to define this is literature or this is not literature, this is just a statement? So how would you define this?
Wow, that's a really good question. But yes, I think literature always has to do something with what goes beyond language, goes beyond words, and which could somehow reach your emotions, that part of your brain which is responsible for images, for visuals. So anything that overcomes words is in fact literature, however weird it may sound. But for me, it's that definition. So for this reason, when you read this book of somebody whose brain was damaged, but he's so poetically trying to describe a tree, and those desperate attempts, they just make you cry. So that's poetry.
Thank you so much. So maybe some other questions from the guests. So please feel free to ask. Okay. Yeah, Katrina, go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, I'd like to say it actually. I just want, first of all, thank you so much for all this wonderful event. It was marvelous. And my question is, I'm pointed from the famous perspective of a person who started to speak another language just about 2 years ago. And it's very new for me discovering how all these relations are going and how it's just going in my everyday life even. And my question is going from one quote which I read before and from which I point and established all my perception of like speaking languages. It's a quote of some kind of a king or something like that. I don't remember who said it. But the thing is that when you're speaking another language, it's like you are having another soul. And when I just read it, firstly, I said to myself, like, this is the reason why sometimes I'm feeling some kind of a glass wall between me and the person with whom I'm speaking in English. And even if I'm trying to express myself fully, I'm feeling like I'm not expressing like all my thoughts, even if I'm using the same words translated from my native language. I just want to ask you how you think the border can be defined. Where are we just having a lack of, maybe a lack of some kind of words, and where these different spaces are mixing with each other, spaces of different linguistic spaces, or how to call it, I don't know. So if it's not clear, I'm so sorry, but I'm not sure how to express this feeling which I'm having right now. So, yes.
Yeah, I totally understand that feeling. Yes, like it's like really being behind this glass wall always, or you're like a fish in the fish tank. So everything is distorted and everybody's looking at you. So that's what happens. And I think I also even faced, no, I'm not going to talk about language discrimination, but this is which something sometimes happens too. But I've also seen that quote about a different soul. And to be honest, I realized that it's also a linguistic stereotype. So it's not true. It's totally not true, because after having those experiences of being mute and speechless, I realized that soul is illiterate. Even when, like, I don't know, hopefully you never had experience of talking to somebody who actually had a brain stroke or something like that. But people in this condition, for instance, people who recover from brain strokes, they remember their experience of being without words, without language, and of staying mute as still the actual experience of their personality and their soul. So there is no difference if you possess the like ability to express yourself or not. You're still the same soul, you're still the same person. And I think this is something probably you realize only after actually having this experience of speech deprivation. So that's why I think it's not that bad. It's just a stage you're currently staying in, but you're going to overcome that. And even if when you start speaking perfectly, you will still feel this glass wall, because this is probably not about speech. It's probably not about language. It's this feeling of detachment, which is probably always with you. Actually, this is how I feel about myself. So I don't know if it's helpful, but at least I can assure you that you don't have a different soul in a different language. It's all the same. It's like the other thing, which is also not true, that you're not able to lie in a non-native language. I also don't remember who said that, but it's a very popular phrase. You're not able to lie. We had an experiment with my friend, movie director. He filmed me lying in English about my life, and it was perfect lies. I even used it in my novel, because I realized, wow, I can lie in a non-native language. So this is bullshit. You can lie. Congratulations.
Okay, thank you so much. I can see another question from Susan. Susan, please go ahead. Susan, I think your microphone is muted. Let me unmute.
There it is. I've got it. Okay.
Thank
Tanya,
you.
thank you so much for your very interesting talk. I studied in Germany for a long time and spoke only in German. And when I came back to the United States, I actually had an accent for a while. So I understand both about the impact of translation on how you can lose something of your language. But I also am a translator, and I believe in translation. Okay, and I think what I think is different about my view is that I think what you're saying about about the impossibility of translation is really about a wrong way of thinking about language, right? That language is so much more than the words on the page. And it is all about that, the parts that you speak about as being related to trauma, but also to our physical experience. And so I wonder if you could speak about that. I mean, we are always translating all the time, is my view. And also that when you go back to your own language, even something you wrote a week ago, it looks different. So I wonder if you could speak to that aspect of things. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. Yes, you're absolutely right, because I also think that maybe in fact it's just my personal experience, and even though translation is correct, translation is probably impossible, but it's still the most astonishing and powerful way to create these bridges between languages. I remember I once talked to my thesis advisor, Matvey Yankilevich, he's a translator and a publisher, about what's his personal approach to translation, and how he had been translating the poetry of those poets who stayed in Leningrad during Leningrad siege. It was very it was unbearable even to read this poetry in Russian. So how he could translate it, and did he try to translate it literally, or he could afford himself to use more, like a little bit more of his personal creative voice, because he's a poet too. And he told me that a translation, it should be a bit strange, and it's always better to make it less poetical, but to make it more straightforward and word by word, because sometimes translation should respectively show the distance between this and that. And it's about letting you hear somebody's voice, but it's also about underlining this distance. And this is what I really, that was the reply I really loved. And I realized that it's also a way to show like how long this distance is between time, between past and present, between cultures. And it's fine if this distance could be felt and seen in a translation. So I don't know. And yes, and about how languages influence one another, it's also funny that I think the Belarusians who speak Russian, they still don't have the Russian accent in their English, which is so weird. It means that our Russian is also accented, and that for people from Moscow, we speak weirdly in Russian.
Yeah, all those physical aspects of language are endlessly fascinating. And but so we need to be more doubtful about language in general. And I have not read anything of yours, but I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So more questions, please. Okay, while we are looking forward to more questions coming around, I have another questions to Tanya. You mentioned that sometimes you get speechless about certain things, and as I understand, this is a random feeling about random things around you. And maybe there are some topics which are really concrete to you in this view. So I mean, there are some topics in your writing which you feel speechless about still? I mean, after all your experiences with translatability and with your writing experiences, are there some things which you're still speechless?
Yeah, I think so. So first, of course, I still feel slightly speechless about my experience as a journalist in Belarus, as a music journalist, and I still have a dream of probably writing about that, about my journalistic career, but not in Russian and not in English. Maybe this will be my first book in Belarusian, actually, because that's the only language probably I can use for speaking about my personal memories of a girl woman music critic living in times of Lukashenko Belarus. I think even fictionally, it's a very cool kind of story. And what actually had been stopping me from doing that, I've always been afraid that some like well-established journalistic or musical characters and figures from Belarus are going to read that, and they will say, no, in fact, it was not like you've written, it was different. So you're probably lying there, and maybe you don't remember it that good. So that's also a symptom, because I feel like I probably was slightly muted by those authoritative male figures who pointed me that that's not true. Oh, you're probably mistaken here. So this is what stops me from writing about my experience as a music critic, because there's always somebody who's much elder than me, who's much more knowledgeable than me, that this person is going to tell me that I misunderstood everything and that was incorrect. And in the past, it didn't happen this way. It's lies. So I think I have to overcome this and just to stop being afraid. And also another thing, I think we all are speechless, is what had been happening in Belarus during the last year, starting from August, because I think I haven't written anything but only one short story, because I realized that how can you write fiction? How can you write anything? How can you make up stories? Well, these crazy things are happening in my homeland. So I felt like I even don't have any rights to speak about anything else while the people are tortured and dying. And that was also some kind of a barrier. But I could write one short story about what had been happening in Belarus. It's called The New Filter. I can send a link to it. It's in Russian so far, but hopefully it will be translated. It's about it's about somebody torturing someone, and they're always accusing each one, and they're like, so in this story you're not able to understand who is who is the oppositioner and who is the KGB officer, because everybody thinks that the other person is non-human. So it's about a total dehumanization of everybody, about mutual dehumanization. So it's like everybody's trying to beat somebody, and you even don't know on whose side you are, because everybody is non-human. And that was the only way I could express what I've been feeling, and that was the only way I could overcome my speechlessness, because I felt I don't have a right to speak, because I'm just a writer and there are actually people who are dying. This is crazy. But also what I could see from my fellow Belarusians, from writers and from poets, a huge, like, lots of poetry emerged after what happened in Belarus in August 2020. I think poetry became the only way to express how you feel, because sometimes when I've been reading the news, I couldn't even feel anything, because I was so traumatized and overwhelmed by Belarusian news that I felt detachment. And you know this, like when you're really traumatized by something, you suddenly all of the feelings are turned off. But when I read somebody's poem about that, I start to cry. So it was the poetry became the only way to help us release our emotions, which are otherwise trapped in this impossibility to perceive, impossibility to feel, and to speak. So hopefully there will be anthologies of poetry devoted to Belarus 220. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you so much. Vera, do I understand correctly that you were raising your hand and you would like to address your question to Tanya? Mm-hmm. Okay, because I saw a reaction, but I didn't realize which one was that, because I've been listening very, very attentively to Tanya, and if there was not a question from Vera, I was thinking about another thing, and maybe at this point of talking of an ability to write about the current situation in Belarus, or an ability to write anything either creative writing, not creative writing, while these things are happening in Belarus. Maybe you could just say a couple of words about your project on dreams about Lukashenko. So what are the perspectives of this project? Because I know that the fragments of it were published and they were translated into English. And what are your anticipations about this project, and what is the future of this project?
So hopefully it will turn into a book, but I'm still thinking about what's the best way to organize this book. First, I started to collect those dreams because I've just been randomly seeing them here and there. It's this apophenia effect when you start to see meaningful patterns in randomness of chaotic reality. But in fact, I really started to spot those dreams here and there. So I started to collect them. And then I realized that every 5 years, I'm going to give this collection of dreams as a gift to Lukashenko. So it was my election gift to him in 2015, and it was my election gift to him in 2020. And in 2020, I realized that I have like hundreds of those dreams, and that they are changing, that after August, they became much more violent. People are trying, like I couldn't even publish most of those dreams because most of the platforms and medias, they just said, Tanya, this is a very cool dream, but it shows so like much violence. It's so full of triggers. We cannot publish that because you cannot even imagine how Belarusian people, in how many ways they would like to get rid of Lukashenko. And they're so inventive and creative in those ways. I mean, their subconsciousness. So I think that by publishing that, I would like to speak about what language and what metaphors our subconscious uses to show us that we're trapped in this autocracy, and how it's trying to either comfort us or opposite, tell us that we have to run, or we have to fight, or we have to escape. Because subconscious is a very, I mean, it's not that smart as our conscious brains are. It operates with very simple metaphors, with very simple set of images and signs. So it's the best way to maybe learn something about Belarusian collective subconscious through investigating those dreams. So it will be probably not about Lukashenko, but it will be about us, about how we cope with this catastrophe, and how we adapt to that, and what is the way to escape it, at least what our consciousness thinks, our subconscious thinks about that. And also, I really hope that people are going to share their dreams with me. I collected some dreams about Trump, for instance. So hopefully it will be a good addition to the project. We'll see.
Okay, maybe something in the perspective of animation, because it's really a very visual thing.
Yeah. Yes, by the way, yeah, it's a good idea about animation.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about our animators at YouTube, because we have really a very powerful team of animators, but I'm not sure about this perspective, as I think that any author working on a subject like this should be a very courageous one. So
exactly.
Yeah, but still I think there is a way to find cooperation, another perspective for cooperation. So okay, thank you for that. I think that I have another question to you, and I cannot avoid this question because you have a very unique situation of being a Belarusian writer who is stating her identity very strictly. So you are stating your identity as a Belarusian writer, and there is no way to identify yourself another way, as I see. But still, you live in Brooklyn, and you still feel yourself related to Belarus. So maybe you could just broaden the context of this personal feeling of relation to Belarusian culture. And I think that maybe here I would even make it a twofold question, because I think that in Belarus we have a very a strange situation when most of our famous contemporary writers become famous when they go abroad. And somehow it turns to the situation when most famous writers are somehow being not shifted from the community of Belarusian writers, but so I feel that Belarusian writers living within Belarus feel somehow dubious about writers living outside. Mm-hmm. So I know that you had a very difficult path within Belarus, and my question to you is here not only about your feelings about being related to Belarusian context and Belarusian culture in general, and it's large, but also maybe there are some personal feelings about the situation of being related or not related to this community of Belarusian writers. So how would you comment that?
Yeah, that was a really difficult thing for me while I've been living in Belarus, indeed. But even because I've been a Russian language writer who always identified myself with the Belarusian speaking community, of course. But I remember once I was not accepted to a very cool contest and seminar for Belarusian writers. I applied, and I think they took literally everyone to that seminar, but not me. I was devastated. And after I realized that it was just because I've been writing in Russian. And at first I thought, oh, discrimination. And then I thought, no, how could it be a discrimination if Russian is the colonial huge language which kind of destroyed the little tiny languages, and it's not discrimination. It's like for the sake of saving Belarusian language. So I'm absolutely fine with that. And I will never, and I don't have the right to even think that I could be discriminated for my Russian. If I would like to take part in a Belarusian language seminar, just go and write something in Belarusian. And speaking about being related to Belarus as a territory, I could detach my way of thinking from that concept, because actually I realized that you can be physically detached from Belarus to be a Belarusian, because I worked for maybe around 9 years. I've been doing a weekly podcast for Belarusian Radio Racja. It's a radio station for Belarusians living in Poland, because you know that Belarus was divided so many times between Soviet Russia and Poland and Soviet Union and whatever. So there is still lots of ethnic Belarusians who live in Poland, in Podlasha, and they speak Belarusian. Their Belarusian is not like our version of Belarusian. It's much more, I think it's more natural, actually. It's what Belarusian language should sound like. And they have their own language, Havorka. They also speak this language, and they understand that it's not Polish, it's not Belarusian, it's their local language. And they have their radio station there in Białystok. So while working for them and while doing my podcast in Belarusian, I talked to these people. I talked a lot about their identity, about how can they be Belarusians with Polish passports, and how they could preserve this identity by staying outside of Belarus since 30s. Like it's incredible how they cherish our culture and how they identify themselves with Belarusians even more than we do. Like some of them once told me, "I'm Belarusian, you're not. You speak Russian in your like regular life, so you're not Belarusian. You have a passport." So that's how I realized that you can be a Belarusian globally, anywhere. It's just a matter of identification. And of course, in the States, and when you study here, the question of self-identification is a very crucial one. It's something you have to decide for yourself very quickly. And you have to understand who you are and how do you represent yourself to other people. And so that was a very instant thing for me. I realized, no, I'm not Russian. I speak Russian, but I'm not Russian. This is the first thing I tell to everybody, or I say, I'm from Belarus. It's not Russia. It's not connected to Russia. It's one of these post-Soviet countries in Europe. So, but anyway, of course, I had this problem of how do you have the right to speak for Belarusians while staying abroad? And I know that lots of writers have been really traumatized by that. And I'm seeing what's happening with Algerd Baharevich right now, because he's on a literary stipend in Germany. And he is writing a novel about our Belarusian revolution. And I've seen some comments on Facebook when Belarusians who are trapped in Belarus, who are unable to escape, they tell him, no, don't write about us, please. You're abroad. You don't have a right. So don't write about me. And this is also traumatizing even for me. I don't know how he feels about it, but this is devastating, because I think that I understand this feeling of detachment between those who stayed and those who could escape. But it's so easy to mute yourself after feeling that you don't have the right to speak on behalf of Belarusians when you're abroad. And I'm trying to do everything not to surrender to this muteness and to still speak aloud. And I'm just ready for those comments. And if I get them, I think I will agree with them, but I won't stop writing.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for such an inspiration again. Well, yeah, I can see a comment from Susan in the chat. This is a form of translatability too. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, thank you, Susan.
Thank you for that. Okay, we have another 9 minutes left, and my question is whether there are some more questions to Tatsiana. So go ahead, please, and don't hesitate to ask your questions, because I have this one last chance, and I think we should use it. And okay, so more questions. Okay, Tatsiana, maybe you would like to pose a question to our guests today.
No, I don't think I have any questions, but yeah, if you're interested, if you want to have this list of book I mentioned, I can just write it somewhere and I can send it to you and you can share it with everybody.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Let's do that. Okay, so no more questions, I see. Okay, yes, Susan is confirming. Okay, I think that I have another last question. And this is just because you mentioned this moment of speechlessness about your career as a musical critic and musical journalist. So my question is, are you still engaged in music things now, or this is an absolutely quitted topic for you? So how do you work about that or not work? So what about this part of your life?
Well, currently I'm just a listener. I'm finally somebody who listens to music and enjoys this music. So maybe I'm going to get back to music journalism, but maybe in the shape of writing this book, because I think also it's a sad thing to say, but I think that you can write about music adequately only when you're young, when you're very young. And I've always told myself, when I'm in my 30s, I will stop writing about music. But no, I didn't stop writing about music, because then I realized there's music for those who are over their 30s and so on. You can write about academic music, you can write about jazz, about avant-garde, about anything, about John Cage, whatever. But and yes, and I think writing about music, there is a famous quote, they say it's from Frank Zappa, but I think it's not true. Frank Zappa never said that writing about music is like dancing about architecture. I researched, Frank Zappa didn't say that, but it's a very cool quote, because it also shows something about your senses mixed, about synesthesia, about muteness, because how can you write about music? Because music is not what is happening in words. Though it's also kind of narrated with the score, but it's a difficult system. It's a different system of narration. So yes, now I just prefer listening to music and think about it, but I'm happy to be liberated from the constant need of translating music into words. I remember once I went in New York, I went to a concert, to a show. I don't remember even who it was. Maybe it was Patti Smith, maybe it was something I really love. And I realized I had this thought like, wow, I'm so happy. I'm at the show, I'm at the concert, and I don't need to write about it. There was a moment of total happiness. And I think that was the end of my music critic career, that finally I can just enjoy it without writing.
Okay, that's great. Oh, maybe some suggestions about most latest hits or releases which you feel especially joyous.
Joyous. I wanted to recommend the new album by Belarusian band Molchat Doma, which is super famous now everywhere, but they're not joyous at all. They're like total despair, death, suicide, but they're so cool. I'm always listening to their last album, Monument, and for me, it's a very adequate depiction of Belarusian inner state of mind.
Okay. Thank you again, Tanya, and I think this was a brilliant session, and I'm really thankful that you joined us and that you shared all your thoughts and ideas. And I think this is a true example of joining creative field and academia. So this is a wonderful and a remarkable example of it. So I'm really happy. It was done with you. Okay. Thank you again. And maybe we have some 5 minutes for some finishing remarks from anyone. So if you like to share,
Katerina. I was today years old when I discovered that Molchat Doma will be Molchat Doma, but not Molchat Doma. Thank you for this right now. So it's just a very fun language game which took place right now. Thanks.
Exactly. I realized that they are Molchat Doma also very recently, because back then I was just sitting in the lockdown and I was silent at home. Molchat Doma. Like, it's fine. Molchat Doma. Everybody is silent at home.
Okay, that's great. So some more finishing remarks, maybe, or maybe a very short question, or anything. Okay, I think there is room to share our reactions again. I'll be the first to do that for a second time. Okay. So I think that we will paste this. A recording of this conversation will be pasted both on the OSUN website and on the EG's website, together with Tanya's recommendations on readings and maybe on music. Okay, so thank you again for joining us, and thank you for this brilliant session.
Yeah, thank you everybody. It was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and hopefully see you again for another meeting or a workshop maybe next time. Okay, so take care and thank you again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. See you soon.